And what I want to do today is to talk to you about learning to like vegetables and why it's difficult to like vegetables, but also how we might use vegetables as a first food in complementary feeding and why we might advocate beginning that kind of process at 6 months when solid foods are introduced. So the outline of the talk is that I'll talk a little bit about complementary feeding and about what advice is given, because there's lots of research out there about the guidelines and what is being advised. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why vegetables are important and why variety is important, why it matters for public health. And then I'm going to talk about the transition that babies make from basically being univores, where they only have the capacity to like and to consume milk, and how they become omnivores. And I'm going to then talk about nutritional wisdom, this idea that children are actually born to be very wise about their choices, but depending on what parents provide them. So, Ellen Satter has said, parents provide, child decides. But if parents are providing, foods which are their foods and not necessarily the best foods, then that's going to have an impact on choice. And then finally, I'm going to talk about some research that we've done using vegetables as a first food. And within that, I want to talk to you a little bit about infant communication and about the ways in which babies tell their parents whether they like something or dislike something, and how they talk to you about hunger and satiety. Because infants are very wise and they do communicate with us. First of all, what advice is given? What are the guidelines? So I've put up here the Start for Life guidelines, but I've also put up complementary feeding guidelines from other countries, because it's interesting that so many coalesce on one message, which is complementary foods at 6 months, but they don't necessarily all give advice about which foods to give first and in what ways to give foods first. So I'm a psychologist, I'm not a nutritionist, and what I'm interested in is behaviour. What do people do? Never mind what the guidelines say, but what do people actually do? And what behaviours can we encourage to get healthy eating from the very beginning of life? So the World Health Organization, I feel a bit embarrassed saying this to people who are already practitioners, because you probably know this way better than me. But this is for my purposes then, just to remind me of what is said. So the WHO says exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months. And then complementary feeding is the beginning of a process of introducing solid, semi-solid or soft foods. And then there's gradual age-appropriate texture presentation. And that's very important, because when we look at those studies from the Avon longitudinal studies, ALSPAC studies, they show that if parents don't give texture, lumps, then at 6 months to 9 months, that crucial time, then children can be quite fussy later on and can have eating problems. So it's really important that texture is introduced. And we also know that the guidelines tell us to introduce a variety of foods, 4 or more food groups, and focusing on health from the start. So the World Health Organization is really about promoting health everywhere for all. But the guidelines for individual institutions and organizations can vary. So for example, the United States talks about developmental readiness. So mums should know if their babies are ready for solid foods by how ready they look in terms of their gut being ready because they can digest solid foods, and readiness in terms of developmental skills. And a lot of mums will say, the baby is reaching out for food, I know that they're ready because they're hungry, but the World Health Organization says exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months of life, and then complementary foods are given then. UNICEF supports that and then says continue to breastfeed for up to two years. And Europe, I don't know if there's anybody here interested in European Union at the moment, it's a hot topic, but we actually have confusing messages in that European Union says introduce solids after 6 months, but EFSA says it's safe to do so between 4 and 6 months, but not before 4 months. So you can see how there's a very simple message about complementary feeding at 6 months, but the individual nation states can differ in what they say and what they advise. And that can lead to some confusion. In this global social media oriented world, mums and dads can get information from any source rather than just trusting the WHO. The guiding principles from the WHO are also very useful, I think, because they talk about the duration of breastfeeding being 6 months, and then maintaining breastfeeding for up to 2 years. And then they talk a little bit about responsive feeding, and that's what I, as a psychologist, am very interested in. This idea that parents could be tuned in to what their children are telling them about their hunger, about their appetite, about their satiety, and also about their likes and dislikes. So responsive feeding is important, but not very well researched. So I'll talk a little bit about that later. Obviously, in relation to complementary foods, safe preparation and hygiene are very important, as well as the content of what foods are being given in relation to both nutrient density and energy density and frequency of the meals being offered. So I won't go into those nutritional details because I'm interested in the psychology. I'll speak a little bit more about that in a moment. So what is actually practiced? So I don't know what the rates are of exclusive breastfeeding in Nottingham, but I know that there are national surveys showing that very few women manage exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months. Most recently, national figures show that it's about 1% of mums can actually manage exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months. And the most common age at which solid foods are introduced is around 5 months. That's the same for France, and it's the same for other countries in Europe. So what is the difference between the guidelines and what mothers actually do? And part of that gap is to do with convenience. Mums are going back to work. It might also be because they realise that their children are ready for solid foods. Whatever the reasons, there's a discrepancy between what is advised and what is really happening. So these are the national surveys, Diet and Nutrition Survey of Infants and Young Children from 2011 and the Infant Feeding Survey. And what's interesting is to see what has happened over time as more and more practitioners are encouraging exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months, or exclusive milk feeding for the first 6 months. And what has happened is that there's been a shift. So the most common age of introduction of solid foods was about 3 months. So when I was introducing foods to my son, who's now 20, I remember picking up foods at the supermarket and they would say, safe 3 to 4 months, safe to introduce your child to these foods at 3 to 4 months. But my health visitor was saying, feed your baby up until 6 months. So I had my health visitor saying something, but the food manufacturers were saying another thing, and now that's changed. So EFSA is saying it's safe to introduce foods 4 to 6 months, but it's best to introduce solid foods at 6 months or after, just after. So it's gone from most common introduction of solids at 3 months to, in 2005, to 4 months, and then now around 5 months, which is the same as in France and in other countries in the European Union. The most common food that is introduced in the UK is baby rice, and that's true of other nations that I've looked at, so cereal-based foods. I've just been in Zambia for a little while, and they use nshima, which is a kind of bread and cereal that they make papi with milk. And basically, cereal-based foods are quite common as a first food. It's unusual to have vegetables as a first food, but I'm going to try and persuade you that that's going to be quite useful, given the bad rap that vegetables have. According to these surveys, by 8 to 10 months in the UK, infants were being offered vegetables at least once a day. So vegetables do get introduced, but not necessarily as a first food. So why do vegetables matter, and why am I going on and on about vegetables? Well, vegetables matter because of their extremely powerful health benefits. So if you look at the data, the World Health Organization estimates that about 1.7 million deaths per annum are caused by diets which are low in vegetables and fruits. At the same time, the World Health Organization aims to reduce by 25% premature deaths from non-communicable diseases by 2025. And partly that's through focusing on lifestyle. So thinking about how we can prevent obesity, how we can prevent diabetes and coronary heart disease, and partly that's to do with the diets that we choose to eat. So the more vegetables we have in our diet, the better. And this has even been adopted in terms of First Lady Michelle Obama growing her own vegetables in the White House, encouraging children to learn about growing vegetables. And even the My Plate, as you can see, half of the plate is devoted to fruits and vegetables, but clearly there's a larger proportion of the plate devoted to vegetables. Why are people interested in vegetables? Why is it so important to have vegetables? Well, it's because of their chemical content. So in terms of the phytonutrients that are in plants, the dietary phytochemicals such as phenolic acids and flavonoids and organosulfur compounds, these have all been shown to have tumour suppressant effects and antioxidant effects. So vegetables carry with them phytonutrients which are known to have benefits to human health. And in particular, the citrus fruits, the green leafy vegetables, beta-carotene rich vegetables, vitamin C rich vegetables, these are all associated with a lower coronary heart disease. And when this article was published in 2013, and then the supplementary article in 2014, it made the newspapers because one of the messages in that article was if British people could try to eat 7 portions of fruits and vegetables a day, that will help their health. That will prevent them from getting unwell later in the future. And the tabloids just thought this was fabulous fun because we can't even get people to eat 5 a day, let alone 7 a day. But that doesn't detract from the research which shows that there are benefits of eating a lot of fruits and vegetables, but specifically vegetables. So the data from Oyebode at UCL was specifically around vegetables, and especially the quantity rather than the variety. So when you look at these large-scale databases, the most important thing for human health is the quantity of vegetables that are consumed. Now we go for 5 a day, fruits and vegetables, 5 a day, but in Australia, parts of Australia, they are going for the 7 a day. So go for 2 and 5, 2 fruits and 5 portions of vegetables a day. That doesn't mean to say they're necessarily successful, but that's their ambition. So they have quite an ambition to get more people eating more fruits and vegetables. So why are vegetables so difficult to get children to eat? Why are they difficult? What is it about the baby that might resist the taste of vegetables? Well, I first of all want to think about that transition that babies are making. So they make a transition from solid foods, from milk to solid foods, and partly they are adapted to a particular food, which is breast milk. And then they have to become omnivorous after the age of 6 months because of the low iron content of the diet, etc. So they have to become omnivores. How do they do that? Well, first of all, they are born univores, adapted to human milk, and they have the innate capacity to like sweetness because breast milk is slightly sweet. So you do not have to learn to like sweetness if you are a mammal because milk is slightly sweet. They also can acquire the ability to move from one food to being omnivorous, eating a variety of foods through learning. And partly the learning is in utero. So whatever the mums are eating in that last trimester of their pregnancy is very important because there are chemical compounds which are transmitted to the fetus. The fetus will drink about 1 litre of amniotic fluid every day for the last trimester. So if you have a mum who's eating lots of garlic or lots of fennel or lots of strong flavours like curry and cinnamon and this kind of thing, some of those volatile compounds will be transmitted to the fetus. And if you want to find out if a newborn baby likes a food, you just put them in a sock and you have 2 sides of the sock. One where there's breast milk which is permeated with garlic, say, and one where it's permeated with no additional flavour, just the breast milk. And babies will orient towards the garlic if their mums ate a lot of garlic in pregnancy. So we know that that in utero experience actually guides the baby towards liking certain flavours, even before they've had their first solid food meal. The other way that babies learn is through experience, so being spoon-fed, or if they're using baby-led weaning, they get to learn about foods, and they also copy. Little children are very good at copying. So if they see their parents eating fruits and vegetables, they too will eat fruits and vegetables. If they see their mum giving them broccoli at a distance because they don't like the smell of broccoli, the baby will find that out and think, well, you know, what's wrong with this food if my mum is you know, not very happy with it? So children will copy and they will learn through mimicry. So if we want our children to be omnivores, to eat a variety of healthy foods, that has to be partly acquired through experience, because babies are born to like one thing, which is human milk. Just to show that point a little bit further, this was a study by Jakob Steiner in the 1970s. I don't think they'd get ethics approval for this anymore. But basically what they did was they had newborn babies before they had their first colostrum, before they had their first experience of breast milk. And they gave these babies solutions to find out what those babies would do in response to those solutions. So I don't think any ethics committee would allow this anymore. But basically, they filmed the babies with sugar in solution, sucrose in solution, with citric acid in solution, which is sour taste of grapefruit or lemons, and the bitter taste, which is quinine sulfate. And quinine sulfate, has anyone in this room had a gin and tonic? Put your hands up. So it's no gin, but the tonic water has quinine sulfate. So bitter is ejected from the mouth at birth because bitterness in nature quite often communicates a toxin. So babies like sweetness, they smile at sweetness, they have a nice reaction to sweet, they purse their lips at sour, and they eject and gape with a bitter food. Already vegetables have a disadvantage. Mums might not be eating enough vegetables in pregnancy, so the baby's not getting much of that flavour exposure in utero. And then when they actually give a vegetable, it might be disliked because bitterness is disliked initially. But we can learn to like bitter because all of us, first time we had bitter might have been a cup of tea or coffee, but we persisted. Some of us have had beer, and the first time we had that age, I'm from Glasgow, I can't possibly say it was around 18 because that's legal. I didn't like it because it was bitter, but I persisted, yeah? So we persist if we really want to acquire a liking for something, but we need assistance if it's bitter. And this reaction to sweetness and to bitter is hardwired. It's something that we see in other species. Other non-human primates, they will show the same gape reaction to bitter and the same positive response to sweet. And even the rat will show an aversive reaction to bitter compared to sweet. And that's because in nature, bitterness can sometimes signal a toxin. So this is a baby having a sweet taste. There's this positive affective response, and then the bitter is this gape. So are babies wise? They're born with the ability to like sweetness. They're born with the ability to dislike bitter because that could be toxic. Do babies know best? And again, I'm going to show you some experimental evidence from a study that would never get past the ethics board. So I hope you don't take the message today that I'm all about unethical experiments, but I think what I'm trying to say is that historically we could probably do a lot more than we can these days. And this was an experiment that was done by a pediatrician, Dr. Clara Davis, in the 1920s and 1930s. She wanted to know what would babies choose if they have a variety of foods to choose from. Now this was the 1920s and 1930s. Donuts and burgers and fries were not available. So she gave these babies whole foods. She gave them raw and she gave them cooked. And she wanted to find out if babies were wise enough to choose a good variety or if they would just choose the sweet foods. because they're adapted to sweetness. Well, they just choose the sweet foods. So she's a paediatrician in the 1920s and 30s. She looked at the ability to select wisely, and she worked with infants from an orphanage, some of whom were quite malnourished. But over the course of her studies, they grew normally and developed very healthily. And in fact, one child actually selectively chose cod liver oil. Has anyone ever tasted cod liver oil? I have. My mum used to give us it when we were little because we lived in Glasgow and we had to be built up for the winter and we had to have cod liver oil. And I remember it's such a horrible taste. But my mum gave it to me, so I've trusted her. And in this study, some of the infants actually chose to drink cod liver oil, and those were the children who were at risk of rickets. So children can be quite wise. So this is just data from one of her studies showing one child. I'll show that in a minute. Sorry, this is data from her studies showing what she did. So the first study she published, it was 3 infants, and she followed them for 6 to 12 months. She weighed everything those children ate, even the bib, so that she could get accurate data. And she published another study in the 1930s, and she actually studied 15 infants for up to 4.5 years. In the end, she was completely snowed under by 36,000 dietary records. So you can't say she wasn't thorough. She was very thorough, but we can't imagine just how much data she had in terms of the evidence of nutritional wisdom. This is one of the nurses offering the tray to the babies. The babies were 6 months and above, and they didn't give them any help. They just let the babies choose for themselves. And this is the foods that they got. So it was raw and cooked meats, raw and cooked fish, raw and cooked cereals, raw and cooked bone products, yum, raw and cooked eggs, milk, fruits, lots of vegetables, and sea salt and cod liver oil occasionally. What did they choose? This is a 1-year-old baby, this is a 1-year-old infant choosing breakfast and choosing supper. And what you can see from the slide is that they have a variety. They are not just going for the sweet foods, even though this is a young baby who could choose just the sweet foods, like the fruits and the milks, but they're not. They're choosing a variety. This is a child who's having milk and raw apple, cooked apple, a lot more cooked apple, because cooked apple is easier to digest. And at supper, again, a variety of foods, fish and egg and bananas, raw oats. Now, even the Scottish know not to eat raw oats because they are dry and they're horrid. And this baby is choosing 10 grams of raw oats and 5 times more of the cooked oats because they're easier to digest. So what this study tells us is that the babies are not just eating their favourite food. They're not just having sweet foods. If you offer a wide variety of healthy foods, children will choose well. And those babies learned to like certain foods. So based on this evidence, there's a whole movement in the UK of baby-led weaning because babies know best. And Ellen Satter also, I think she's in the United States, has talked about parents provide, child decides because they're wise. So in her study, then, I should just say that in her study, the children grew well, they developed normally, and as I say, 1 or 2 children actually reversed the signs of rickets. So children can be wise. But of course, the main problem with the study was that they were not given processed foods, and they were not given French fries and confectionery and that kind of thing. What would they have eaten if they'd been given those sorts of foods? And the answer is we don't know, because no one will be ever able to do this type of study ever again. But what we can say is that when given a variety of healthy foods, they will eat healthily. So let's talk a little bit about vegetables as a first food. So if we're thinking about healthy eating from the beginning, what happens if you give vegetables first? Can we give vegetables first? So vegetables are harder to eat because they're bitter. Vegetables are harder to eat because they might have a texture that's unfamiliar. And vegetables are harder to eat if the parents are not already eating those and it's not something that they typically have. So there was a study done through the Habit project, which I belong to, where vegetables were given as a weaning food. So basically given at complementary feeding around 5 to 6 months whenever the mothers decided to introduce solid foods. So this is my colleague Ali Fields, and she was based in London. And she compared this vegetables first approach in London versus Portugal versus Greece. So she did 3 different comparisons between the UK, London, Athens and Porto. And on the basis of some of this work, which we've done with a stakeholder group which have industry partners in it, we developed a weaning guide. So you can download this weaning guide if you're interested from the HabEat platform. And the HabEat platform shows how mums can introduce vegetables as a first food. And what she found in this study, this is a trial that they've published in the British Journal of Nutrition, what they found in this trial was that if vegetables are given as a first food, then a novel vegetable like artichoke is eaten in greater quantity. So the red bars refer to the intervention group. They've had the vegetables first, and they will eat more of a novel vegetable when they're being followed up at 6 months and then 12 months later. Whereas with the peaches, there's no big difference between the 2 groups because peaches are sweet and they're naturally liked. But interestingly enough, in this study, there was no benefit to the Portuguese or the Greek. Can anyone say why that might be? Why is there no benefit to the Greek or Portuguese? Can anyone hazard a guess? They already have such a lot of vegetables in their diet. So giving the weaning food as veg first had no impact because they already had a lot of vegetables in their diet. And in Portugal in particular, complementary feeding occurs with soups, and they give vegetable soups. So they already had a very high level. In fact, when we were in Portugal for part of this study, some of the health visitors said to me, you know, the big problem in Portugal, the kids eat too many vegetables. And I thought, I think I've never heard that said before in my life. How can you eat too many vegetables? But anyway, that's their complaint in Portugal. It's not our complaint in the UK. A study that was done by Andrea Maya North, she compared mums in Dijon with mums in Aalen, so they're geographically very close, French and German, geographically very close but different culturally. And she introduced a no variety weaning strategy, carrots every day for about 12 days, versus a low variety where the vegetables were changed a little bit, and then a high variety where the vegetables were changed every day. And this was a study of 147 mums around about 5 months of age, median weaning age in France. And what they've done is they've followed those children up for 6 years. And there are 2 observations that you need to know about this study. One is that breastfed children accept vegetables anyway because they've got so much flavour experience through breast milk. Breast milk has so many complex chemicals giving the children experience of flavour. So breastfeeding increases acceptance of vegetables anyway. And on top of that, the variety group, the high variety, even 6 years later, those children were eating more vegetables. So the take-home message from this particular study, because they were studied for so long, is breastfeeding is, of course, extremely facilitative of healthy eating because breastfed babies love to have new foods because they've had a lot of flavour experience. And the other thing is that even if breastfeeding doesn't occur, if variety can occur early in life, variety of vegetables, this will have a long-standing, durable impact on intake 6 years later. Very small intervention, very long result. So we've also done a complementary feeding trial, and this was in the UK. So we were part of the VIVA project. VIVA project stands for V is for vegetable, and it was a partnership, European Union funding, but a partnership between academics in St Andrews, Aberdeen, Leeds, Glasgow Caledonian, and Danone. And what we did was we interviewed French mothers and said, you know, what do you do when you introduce solid foods to your babies? And they said, well, we add flavour to our breast milk and we feed it to our babies, or we add flavour to our formula and then we give it to our babies. And we said, what do you mean? And they said, well, we cook vegetables and then we take the cooking liquor and we add it to milk so that the babies can become French. They're so worried about the children acquiring a liking for, as they call it, junk food and foods that are less healthy, that they begin to introduce flavours of vegetables at the very beginning of complementary feeding using cooking water from the vegetables. And they talk all the time about educating the palate. Whereas in our mums from Leeds, they talk mostly about getting enough nutrition in. So the French mums talked about educating the palate, making the palate French. And in Leeds, the issue was around nutrition, getting enough nutrition in. So we did a little bit of an experiment where we said we're going to do what French mums do, but we're going to do it in Leeds. So we gave babies vegetables in their milk, breast milk or formula for 12 days, and then vegetables in their baby cereal for 12 days. And then we looked at whether or not they liked vegetables more. And in the control group, the children just had their normal breast milk or formula and then normal cereal, baby rice. The average age of taste introduction was about 5.5 months, and that was determined by the mums, not by us. This was the design of the study. So the control group, plain milk, plain baby rice, then exposure to vegetable puree, and in the intervention, a variety of vegetables on a rotation. So we changed the vegetable every day, and we gave the mums a little diary and said, today it's carrots, today it's green beans, today it's broccoli. And believe it or not, we couldn't find a baby food jar in this country that had a single vegetable. So we had to bring those single vegetable baby jars from the European Union, principally from Poland and from France. Because in our country, we insist upon combining foods. And what we wanted was the pure taste of the vegetable. So we had to bring these foods in from overseas. And we also used jars just because we wanted to be systematic. We didn't want mums adding salt or sugar or whatever, so we used our own pure vegetable flavours. So there was 18 mums in each group, and to be sure that baby milk and baby rice actually tasted of the vegetable, we gave these different intensities of vegetable to adults, and they had to rate them on a sensory scale. And what we found was that, yes, they could taste the vegetables at this intensity. There's no point in giving babies vegetable in their cereal or vegetable in their milk if they can't taste it. So we did a sensory panel assessment. We also filmed the baby's reactions to the vegetable the first time they got the vegetable. So we had pure carrot, pure green bean, spinach, broccoli, parsnip, and we added it to baby milk, breast milk or formula, depending on the mother, and then we gave it in baby rice, and we mixed it together. And this is just showing you the process. And this is the milk before it's shaken up to make it a lovely green colour. Yum. And what we also did when the mums came to the lab to be filmed was we asked the mums to spoon feed their baby, but then to stop when the baby refused 3 times. And we trained the mums. Unexpectedly, one of the benefits of the study was the mums liked the training. They liked to see what their baby was communicating to them. So that's another arm of our study. We're interested in telling mums a little bit more about what babies are saying when they give facial expressions and behavioural responses to a new food. So in our study, liking was rated by the mum, by an independent rater and by a researcher, and the facial expressions and the behaviours were coded with blind raters. That means people who didn't know the intervention and control group. And we also weighed all the food intake in the lab. And this is the sort of thing we trained. If the baby says no the first time and no the second time and turns their head away, don't give them any more of the food. And we filmed each sequence of spoon feeding, and we were able to capture every frame. So this is the baby ready for the spoon. This is the spoon being offered. So is the baby opening their mouth ready for the spoon to go in? And then how do they respond once the actual vegetable is in? Yeah? And are they ready to accept another? So even though they've got this face and they seem not to want this food, they're ready again. And sometimes mums will misconstrue what the baby is saying. They may be showing these responses because they're a little bit surprised. This is new to them, but it doesn't mean they don't like it. So we have looked at behavioural responses like turning the head away when given a food. That means that they've had enough of that food. Pushing the spoon away, they don't want it anymore, they don't want it near them even. Crying if mum is offering this food, and fussing, and also the very famous leaning forward, which is where they really want the food. So there's one positive behaviour that we've noticed, which is leaning forward. All the others are very strong features of not wanting the food, of avoidance. So we see a lot more avoidance behaviours in the babies than approach behaviours. And we look at facial expressions: nose wrinkling, brow lowering, inner brow raising, squinting, and also the famous gape, where the baby is trying to expel the food from the mouth. So we have now coded these facial expressions for all the babies in our study, and we've published the data. And sometimes the babies show a negative response, and sometimes they turn their head away, they've had enough. So that better not to think about that immediate response. It's not necessarily disgust, it's not necessarily dislike, it might just be surprise. And what we found in our research is that we need about 10 to 15 exposures before babies will like a food. On average, in the UK, mums give up after 3 attempts because they don't want to waste the food and they think the baby doesn't like that food. But vegetables take 10 to 15 times. We're interested in communication cues, what the babies are telling us, and we've published a paper talking about this trial, and this is the strong reaction but accepts the food that I mentioned. And we've also looked at whether those facial responses and those behaviours mean anything, and they do. The intake is inversely related to turning head away. So the more a child turns their head away, the less they eat. The more they arch the back, the less they eat. And the more that they accept it quickly, the more they eat. So these facial expressions link well to how much is consumed, and they link well to liking, either the mother's liking ratings or the researcher's liking ratings. So they're meaningful. And in the end, our intervention showed that the children who were exposed to the variety of vegetables ate more vegetables. And not only did they eat more vegetables overall, but they ate them faster, which suggests to me that they really like the vegetable, because the rate of eating is about liking and about hedonic value. So the intervention group is higher in the rate of acceptance of the green bean as well as the carrot. So much faster pace of eating with the vegetables than in the intervention group. And this is just showing you this sequence that we do where we code each part of the filmed experience. And also just to show you that the facial expressions and the behaviours are different between carrots and green beans. Carrots are well liked because they're slightly sweet, whereas green beans are more difficult to like because they're slightly sulphurous and slightly bitter. So it takes a lot more exposure. But in our intervention group, they like the green bean because they've been exposed to it. So we're now doing a piece of research and we need your help. And if you're interested, we would like to email you and ask your advice, because we're now setting up a little resource to help mums to understand what their babies are communicating to them. So we're trying to help mums to recognise their infant communication of hunger, appetite and satiety. This is Kate Austin, one of our PhD students, a lecturer at Leeds Beckett University, and she has agreed to be our guinea pig. And so we've asked her to feed her baby so that we can put a resource together, and we've watched the baby grow over time, and we've changed the name of the baby to protect her anonymity, and we've given her her actress name. So we're helping mothers to recognise infant communication. We're developing a resource. We'd like you to give us your feedback about that, and so if you're interested, we will email you and let you know, because we'd love to hear what you think of our resource. So finally, my take-home messages are: the advice on complementary feeding is very clear about when, 6 months, not so clear about how and which foods to introduce. Introducing vegetables as a first food can be done. It's been successful in the studies that we've shown you through the Habit study and through the Viva study. Infants communicate to their mothers and fathers about hunger, satiety, liking and wanting, but sometimes mums don't cue into that, and we need to give them some support in that. And complementary feeding practices are changing, so a lot of health visitors are talking now about baby-led weaning, but we don't have a lot of evidence on baby-led weaning. Basically, baby-led weaning, we don't know very much yet about whether it's beneficial in the long term, because baby-led weaning is often confounded by education and by class. It's more middle class, more educated mums, older mums who use baby-led weaning. And that might be the benefit rather than the practice. But we should keep doing more research in this area so that we can give you the evidence that you need in your practice.